Good morning, everyone. Please open your Bibles to Luke chapter 14. This will be our passage for this morning. Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 25. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." When historians examine the scriptures to try to give evidence or proof even that the Bible is an accurate recording of what happened, one of the evidences is that there are recorded for us difficult sayings. It doesn't make sense that someone would create a religion and then employ these difficult sayings in the mouth of the head of the religion. If someone's going to create a religion, you would think they would make things a little easier than this. And this is actually one of the evidences that we have a sturdy recollection and a sturdy recording of the words that people heard Jesus say, is that Jesus includes hard sayings, such as what we read here in verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, even his own life, cannot be his disciple. That's a hard saying. And yet it's here, and we've got to do something with it. And Jesus' emphasis here is really on discipleship and the imitation of Christ, because that's what discipleship is. It is imitating Jesus in our behaviors. Early Christians understood discipleship to be the imitation of Christ. There's even one early writer who writes lamentably, what would our world be like if Jesus imitated us, right? How much more so should we be imitations of him? And when we examine this, Jesus is teaching us about discipleship and, of course, one unique aspect of discipleship, which is the cross and what it means to carry a cross, what it means to have an end goal that is the cross. Because Jesus is using the word cross, and if you're thinking chronologically, Jesus has not yet gone to the cross, and his disciples don't really understand that his end goal at this point is the cross. He is on his way to Jerusalem. That's what Luke keeps reminding us. If you're reading Luke's gospel, he just writes, he is setting his face toward Jerusalem. He is going to Jerusalem. And Luke brings this up again and again. And it's because Jesus is setting his eyes on the next big thing, which is the cross. And so when Jesus says to take up your cross and follow me, he's speaking on one hand in a sense that they don't understand. They don't know what Jesus is about to go do. But on the other hand, this isn't like a special word. They know what a cross is. They know that people are crucified on them. They know that Jesus is in effect saying, "Come be crucified with me." And all of this has to do with discipleship and this very unique aspect of discipleship, which is imitating Jesus in being willing to go and suffer, being willing to do hard things, being willing to put God ahead of even our wants. And what I like to do is to look at this passage, break it down a little bit, and examine what Jesus is saying and what it really means for us. So you have first, I'd like to read verses 25 through 27, and just think about these verses. We read, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple.'" Here Jesus is teaching us to give up our lives, but in order to understand what this is saying, I want us to consider what it means for something to cost something. And in order for something to cost something, I'm going to put it like this to kind of give us some good footing. It has to eat up something. It has to devour something. So if you want to buy something and it costs money, it eats up your bank account, right? It devours part of your bank account. And in the same way, in order to come to Jesus, we have to understand that discipleship eats up parts of our lives. It's a trade. It's kind of there is something more valuable than these parts of our lives, and we are eating up parts of our lives for something that is more valuable. Discipleship consumes something in our lives. It's not in addition to what we have. It consumes what we have. And when we look at this passage, there's something really important I want to remind us, that in early Christianity, there was no such thing as a Christian who was not a disciple. Those were not separate ideas. Early Christians were disciples who imitated Jesus. And they saw themselves as the image of Jesus in the world they were in. Jesus wasn't in addition to who they were. It wasn't like a category in their life. Jesus was their life. And so in order to come to this passage, I think we have to understand that discipleship consumes. It costs something. It consumes part of our life. And the particular aspect of discipleship here that Jesus is emphasizing is the cross. There are multiple aspects of discipleship. But the particular aspect that's being emphasized here is the cross. And having a life that is consumed with God in order to be able to go to the cross. That's kind of going to be the climax of this lesson. So spoiler alert, just kind of start be thinking about that. If you don't have a life that is consumed by God, you cannot go to the cross. Jesus is speaking about a life that is consumed in some respects. It costs something in order to go to the cross. And isn't that exactly what happened to Jesus on the cross, right? I mean, his life was consumed just as Jonah was swallowed up by the great fish. It consumed him. It devoured him. It costs something. I want us to be thinking in these terms as we come to this passage, because if we don't understand that when something costs something, it consumes something, I don't think we're going to come away from this with the right perspective. That discipleship costs something. It's not in addition to who we are. It consumes who we are. Now, there are two aspects here of life in general that Jesus references in verses 26 and 27. First is relationships. Right? All these different kinds of relationships. The relationship to one's father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, and even his own life to himself. Because the self is a relationship. We have a relationship to ourselves. And on one hand, we want to point out and say Jesus is not saying that we cannot have affection for these relationships. Of course, there's another passage where Jesus condemns people for using Corban as a way of getting out of honoring their father and mother. So of course we need to honor our father and mother. But Jesus is really trying to get a point across. And I think the point he's getting across is, remember, this is all coming back to the cross and how to be someone who can go to the cross. There is something that often prohibits us, and that is our relationships. Sometimes we love people too dearly. We care what they think so much that we are unwilling to do good and godly things because of that. And so there are these two aspects of life that are expressed here. First is relationship, because so much of life is relationships. And the second is one's own life, one's soul, who we are in our inner selves, who we are secretly when no one is looking. That there has to be this denial of who we are in order to be able to go to the cross. We have to have an inner self that is consumed by discipleship. Like Paul says, right? Take every thought captive to Christ. Our inner selves is consumed with this cost of discipleship and being able to go to the cross. Because when we're not, our inner selves are not consumed by God, we often have our wants. We have who we are in mind, and we want to do these things for us. And so Jesus is discussing these two aspects of life, and these two aspects of life are particularly barriers to going to the cross. And I want us to understand here, he says in verse 27, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. I want us to understand the uniqueness of our crosses. My cross, the things I have to deal with, are not the same things you have to deal with. And the truth is that you cannot carry my cross. Now, you may be able to encourage me and help me to carry my own cross, but you can't carry it for me. We each have our own unique crosses. And sometimes in life, our crosses change. Sometimes we're dealing with one thing that we've just got to endure, and sometimes over life it changes to a different kind of cross. But we have a unique cross that we have to take up because we're unique people, unique circumstances, unique relationships, unique situations. But all of us have to take this up. And so on one hand, we want to understand that we have unique crosses, but we also want to understand they are crosses nonetheless. And what I mean is we can't belittle someone for the cross that they're carrying. We can't say, well, what you've got is easy, what I've got is hard. Because maybe it would be easy for you, but you don't know what it's like for them. They have their cross. And no cross is easy to bear. Our lives are unique, and therefore our crosses are unique. So in examining this passage, we want to understand that when something costs something, it eats up something. It devours something. And discipleship costs something. It's not in addition to our lives. It's not a category of our lives. It consumes our lives. And each cross that we have to bear is a very unique cross. Now, Jesus starts to give us two examples of what it means to take up our cross and to be disciples. And I'm going to approach it from this perspective. One example is counting the cost of being a disciple, and one example is counting the cost of not being a disciple. Because when you count a cost, you've got to count a cost both ways. Right? What is the cost of buying shoes? But what's the cost of not buying shoes? What are your feet going to look like? What is your life going to be like? What is going to consume your foot if you do not wear shoes? There's a cost to something of getting it, but there's also a cost to something of foregoing it. And I think in Jesus' examples here, we see not only the cost of being a disciple, but also the cost of not being a disciple. The first example he gives us is of building a tower. So starting in verse 28, Jesus says, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Have you ever known someone who actually started to build a building and didn't finish it? When Bailey and I were in Boise for years, in downtown Boise, there was just this giant pit, and it was called The Pit, and it was full of concrete and rebar, and that was it, because someone started and they couldn't finish it. And it was this shame on the city, just this kind of open shame that, and finally, after years, that people were able to raise enough funds, and they got companies involved to build an actual building there. And they gave out shirts saying, like, "I helped fill the pit." I mean, people were so rejoicing in this that they handed out shirts, because having started something and not finished it was so shameful. Jesus is trying to get across what it means to start and not be able to see it through to the end. Now, we understand Jesus is speaking from the perspective of a person who is actually going to be crucified. He knows what it is to start a ministry without seeing it through to the end. And he is also encouraging us to be people who can see it through to the end. But he also tells us, remember, the passage starts in verse 25. He's speaking to a large crowd who is following him. And he is warning them, you need to count the cost. Anytime I've met someone who wants to become a Christian, I sit down with them and I point to this passage and I say, you need to count the cost. You need to understand what you're getting into. And Jesus gives us this example of someone who starts to build something. And I think this is, of course, a remarkable example of what it means to be a disciple. Discipleship is in many ways building things. Right? We are building our capacity to pray. We are building a kind of maturity in our lives. It's building something. But what's the point of building it if when we need it the most, we can't use it or we refuse to use it? What's the point of building this tower if when it comes to go to the cross, we say no? And so Jesus gets us into thinking we need to count the cost, because once we start, we cannot stop. He sums this up, in verse 33, both of these images summed up, verse 33. "So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." It is better not to start than to start and not finish. That's the point here. That's a hard saying. It is better not to start than to start and not finish. So he gives us this first image of counting the cost, understanding that we are building something. Right? You're going somewhere. You're building a new person in who we are. But then he gives us this second image, verses 31 and 32. "Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace." Now, I think, as I said, I want us to understand this in terms of the cost of not being a disciple. That the cost of not being a disciple is like going into battle unprepared. Just consider the example I used before about wearing a shoe. There's a cost to buying shoes. There's also a cost to not wearing shoes. One of those costs is you're not really prepared to go out walking. You're unprepared. And you have this image here of this king who thinks he's prepared. And when he faces this reality, you find he's totally outmatched and he's unprepared. there is not only a cost to becoming a disciple, there is also a cost to not being a disciple. And I think this cost is really seen in being like going to battle unprepared. If you're not a disciple of Jesus, you go up against this world unprepared. You can't make sense of things like suffering. You can't make sense of the world and its ideologies. We're just tossed to and fro, like Paul says. It is like going into battle unprepared when we are not disciples. And of course, in the end, if we are people who are not disciples, we are counted as enemies of God. And in the end, we go up against God. You see, not being a disciple also has a cost. It also has something that consumes us. And this thing that consumes us is not good in any sense. It makes us totally unprepared for life and for eternity itself. Jesus here then sums up the verses 25 through 33 by this description about salt and manure. He says in verse 34, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Jesus usually says that about people who have ears to hear, let him hear about really important things. This is his way of drawing our attention to what he's saying. And Jesus is here pointing out that it is better not to start than to start and not see it through to the end. Now, let's take this back to the point of this passage. The point of this passage is discipleship, and more specifically, going to the cross as disciples. It is better not to start than to start and not finish. That is to say, it is better not to start than to start and stop short of the cross. What would Jesus' ministry have been like if he stopped short of the cross? There'd be no ministry at all. It is better not to start than to start and not finish. And when we come up to the cross, our own unique personal crosses, that is when we want to stop the most. And it is better not to start than to start and not finish. I mean, Jesus here says, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. Jesus is saying something that once was good is now less good than manure. And it's not like they have a high view of manure or anything like that. They think of manure exactly as we do. They don't think of this as something good. They think of it as something that is nasty, but also useful, right? You can't really farm without it. So it's unpleasant but useful. Something that is unpleasant and useful is better than something that was once good but has stopped. This, I think, totally flies in the face of how we think, in a kind of A for effort culture. We tend to think of, well, at least you tried. And maybe there are times to say that, but this is not one of those times. This is not an at least you tried moment. It is better not to start than to try at all and fail. This is a really hard saying. Jesus, however, I think, in his example of how he actually went to the cross, helps us to see this in a different light. Because when we see it in a different light, we begin to realize this isn't about, I need to try harder. This is about, God will see me through this when my life is consumed by God. How did Jesus go to the cross? And that's what Jesus is kind of making this parallel example about, how he went to the cross and this example he sets for us and what we need to do in going to the cross. How did Jesus go to the cross? Jesus went to the cross with, you might say, a whole life eaten up by God. Just a life devoured by God. God was not just a category of his life. God was everything. Jesus would just break away from the crowd to go be in silence with God on the mountain. God was everything. This is not merely about trying harder to struggle to the cross. This is about understanding how to go to the cross. That when our lives are not properly cleansed of the things that have nothing to do with God, we just can't do it. We're incapable. I want you to, this is what I said at the very beginning. This is where we're going with all of this. Pay attention to what Jesus says here. In verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, and then he says, he cannot be my disciple. Not he won't be my disciple. He can't. Verse 27, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. It's not just that he won't be my disciple. He's a bad image of what a disciple is. It's that it's an impossibility. It cannot happen. Jesus went to the cross with a life consumed by God because that's the only way to do it. That's the only way it becomes even possible. This isn't about we just need to try harder to struggle to the cross. This is if God is not our life, we just won't be able to do it any more than you can use a $100 bill to buy a Mercedes-Benz. You just can't do it. You cannot go to the cross when God is not everything. When God is not actively working in our lives to give us the strength to go to the cross. Because in the Bible there's multiple kinds of grace, right? There is unmerited favor, it's often called. There's that kind of grace where God kind of has favor on us and looks nicely upon us because of what Jesus did, not because of anything we did. There's also the sense of grace that God works through us to help us do things we can't do on our own. And so you have, the spiritual gifts, the spiritual graces. God is working through people to help them do these things they just can't do on their own. And when God is not a part of our lives working through us, we just can't go to the cross. Because it's not a matter of trying harder. You can try all you want. If God's not a part of your life, you just can't do it. Until God is our life, we can't do things like this. It's just not possible. This isn't a matter of, someone who is a bad image of a disciple versus someone who's a good image of a disciple. This is not just about this person is disobedient and this person is obedient. It's about this person lacks the power to do it and this person has the power to do it. And it's only when God is our life that we can do that. Until God is our life, we can't go to the cross and we can't do hard things. Until God is everything in our life and has devoured our life, right? It's impossible. Jesus is not just telling us a matter of obedience versus disobedience in verses 26 and 27. When he speaks about these relationships and giving up, have these relationships have an utmost importance in our lives and giving up this love that we have of ourselves. This is not just about obedience and disobedience. It's that it is not possible to go to the cross until we can view 26 and 27 as something we should do. Without 26 and 27, you can't do it. One important thing to keep in mind then is that God is our ultimate end. When God is not our ultimate end, and what we have in sight as we go forward, you stumble when you get to the cross. When God is not our ultimate end, when our jobs are our ultimate end, that is the most important thing we're doing. When our families, our relationships are our ultimate ends, right? This is the most important thing in our lives. When those things are our ultimate ends that we are trying to reach, we will always stop short of the cross. It is not until God is the ultimate end that we can actually imitate Jesus and go to our own unique crosses. Because if these relationships are your ultimate ends, what would you do when you get to be Jesus and all your friends abandon you? How could you go to the cross when your ultimate end is the very thing that is no longer in your life? Or what about our selfishness and ourselves? How could we ever go to the cross and endure pain and suffering as Jesus did if all we think about is ourselves and ourselves are our ultimate ends? God himself must be the ultimate end we have in sight. Otherwise, we can't do it. Jesus, like I said, he's not just talking about obedience versus disobedience. He's talking about possibility versus impossibility. And he is giving us the tools by which this becomes a possibility. It becomes a possibility through discipleship, through a whole life that is consumed by God, because discipleship costs something, and by a life that views God as our ultimate end, though all in life should abandon us. Jesus was aware of the difficulties of being his disciple, but he was also aware of the difficulties of not being a disciple. And he's trying to get us to see the cost of both. At this time, we always offer an invitation. If there's anything we can do to help you to be a better disciple, if there's any way we can assist you in having a life and working toward a life that is consumed by God, please talk to us. If you need help in any way, if you need prayers, if you have questions, if there's anything we can do, please talk to us, or even come forward now as we'll stand and sing the song of invitation.